NSFW forensic scientists of Reddit. What is the most WTF case that you ever had? A friend of mine is a CSI, and I don't know if he's posted here, but just in case he hasn't, I'll put this here. Anchorage, Alaska, 2008. The 27-year-old woman hasn't paid her rent in 4 months. The landlord gave her a bit of a reprieve because he knew she was very poor and she was in low-income housing. But after 4 months of zero contact, enough is enough, and he calls the cops to get into her place and either see her to talk or change the locks and remove her stuff to a storage shed so the apartment can be released to someone else. The cops find the front door to be bolted and use the landlord's key to get in. Then find the woman dead in her shower. Just sort of slumped, as if she fell against the wall and slid down. The water wasn't on, and as this is Alaska and the winter, the water is never shut off by the city because if hot water isn't moving through the pipes they freeze and burst. The fact that her shower is off means she never turned it on. Or someone turned it off. The body is taken to the morgue and autopsied at the family's request because no obvious means of death can be found. As far as the examination could conclude, she died from an adrenal surge causing her heart to stop. More commonly known as frightened to death. Which yes, can actually happen in some rare cases. The body was old, but no test showed any residual drugs in her system. None were found in the apartment. Nor was any sign of anyone having entered or left before the cops. A young pretty average health woman appears to have gotten into her shower, and then her heart stopped due to terror. As far as I know. That's where the story ends. No substantial leads. A friend of mine is a forensic scientist and her department dealt with burglary cases only. Usually generating pretty uninteresting stuff to tell people. But her only good story is that once she got a pair of gloves found at the crime scene. She went to examine them and felt that there was something hard inside. She turned the gloves up to get it out. And out falls a thumb. Ripped off at the first joint. Apparently this particular burglar was holding up a safe while his mate went underneath it, dropped the safe on his hands. Ripped his hands out and ran. They obviously caught the guy. Croft showed a case where a guy committed suicide by holding 2 forks on a table then proceeded to headbang towards it. Stuck both his eyes in. Not a forensic scientist, surprise. But my mom knew a lady whose son committed suicide pretty brutally. While the parents were out, he got a shotgun from the gun cabinet, went to his room, and set it up with string and pulleys on a chair so that it would go off when the bedroom door was opened. He sat in the chair for what may have been hours. Parents get home, mom goes to check on son bang. That poor woman needed some serious counseling. I can't imagine the guilt. And it was pretty shitty of the kid to make one of his parents unwittingly do the dirty work for him. Father-in-law is a cop. Years ago, he got called to a scene of a suicide by hanging. The body had been there for a while. Apparently the deceased had managed to do quite a bit of damage to his neck vertebrae because his spine had snapped and his neck stretched down several feet from the noose. The cops at the scene took pictures of giraffe neck and passed them around the department. Somehow, my wife saw the pictures when she was at the tender age of 12. Which screwed her up good enough to be a suitable mate for a guy like me. A friend is a psychologist whose previous life was in crime scene photography. She went to the scene of a suicide in a garage. This guy had a project car that he had worked on his whole life. When he decided to end it all he wanted to go with the car. So he shut the garage and turned on the engine and waited. To top it off. He had taken a bunch of pain and sleeping pills. When my friend got there it was a good while after his death. The MTs and other specialists were there looking for details and whatnot. He was the VP of a fairly large chain of local businesses, so there was an insurance settlement to consider. My friend is in the middle of photographing the scene and the guy was laying there. Pronounced dead hours ago, and he suddenly just shook hard. She thought it was a death rattle, so she kept taking pictures. Eventually the guy sat up and nodded and the EMTs were called back in to stabilize him and eventually save him. Apparently the car had run out of gas right at the moment he went out and he was pronounced dead on the scene. He couldn't talk or do much, but he had actually survived. Forensic chemist here. Who occasionally gets called out to crime scenes just to consult on evidence collection. On the first one I ever went on. The father had shot his adult son and put the body in a deep freeze that was in his bedroom. There were a ton of cops and other people from our lab there, but when the coroner asked for help removing the body from the freezer, I volunteered quickly, as I had never been that close to a dead body other than funerals and was curious. As I helped the coroner lift the body out of the freezer, which still had a bunch of food in it too. The pack of frozen biscuits was stuck to his body. I had to pry them off of him. Which was both very weird and kind of funny at the same time. The MT here. We had a guy who was naked, bloodied, and tortured. Then left outside in -10-degree weather until he froze. We found him literally frozen maybe a day after the fact. Now, My question is, how the hell do you move a 230 lb popsicle without breaking it? Edit. Words. I interned at the office of the chief medical examiner when I was 18. Saw a lot of interesting stuff. Learned a lot of interesting things. One case stuck with me more than the rest. I arrived one morning, went down to the basement where bodies were laid out for rounds every morning. On tables lay the usual. The couple folks who died in a hospital and needed a partial autopsy to sign off on a death certificate. A drug overdose. A drug murder. Then, on one table, there was a blue Tupperware bin. A big one. About 3x3x2. It was filled with concrete. And out of the edges a little plastic wrap was lining between the concrete and the bin. And then out of the top of the concrete a couple toes were poking out. A story was out in the county. A family saw a small fire in the woods outside of their house. Called the fire department. And after putting out the flames, they found this bin. When we cracked the bin open we found half of a man, about from the belly button down. Someone had thought the best way to dispose of this body would be to cut it in half, wrap it in plastic, put it in a Tupperware bin, fill the bin with concrete, and set it on fire. What they had really done was essentially cook the body in an oven, with the plastic wrap acting as a roasting bag. Skin was sloughing off of the legs and feet, and the skin was discolored by this time, a nice green. Though this was about 10 years ago, I distinctly remember still being able to make our saw marks on the top edge of this half. However, notes were taken, and no signs of death were found on the legs, and no indications of the person's identity either. Unfortunately, my internship ended a few weeks before they found the top half, so I never got to learn more about the case, but the image still certainly sticks with me till now. Not a forensic scientist, but a true story is good all the same. Officer I used to know was telling me of this kid's suicide. The parents had left for the day and the kid decided enough is enough. He grabbed his dad's shotgun and sat down on the sofa. With the shotgun in his mouth. He pulled the trigger. Blood, brain, and teeth covered the entire room and ceiling. The blast created a huge hole in the back of his head. Since the gun was in his mouth, he just sort of slid down the barrel. The parents come home and walk in to see their son sitting on the couch, shotgun in his mouth with a barrel protruding out of the back of his skull. Man. 40Y. Oh. Phil's wife and children with army rifle, old model, circa 3000 joules muzzle energy. Puts the muzzle under the chin and fires, the bullet takes half the face away. Blood drops lead to bathroom. In front of the mirror. Then to the ammo box. And finally to the place of the second and last shot to the head. And a case of someone found dead from a gunshot wound to the heart. On a bridge. Without any weapon, bullet or cartridge case. Circumstantial evidence finally indicated a suicide, but we still don't know how he got the weapon to float away. The bottom of the river was searched, and nothing was found except the tools of the bridge builders. Edit 1. I see the second case inspires a lot of people who suggest a way to make the weapon disappear. Be assured that a lot of possibilities were imagined and discussed during the inquiry. The problem is, and this is, where reality separates from fiction, we must bring facts to the table, supported by the traces and evidence. So, someone taking the gun. A dozen of helium-filled balloons, or a wooden floater tied to the gun are all possibilities, but as long as we don't have evidence backing them, they are pure speculation, as good as any other. Edit 2. For those of you that want some more forensic WTF and can read French, I recommend Edouard Launet's Vie and Freud et Cornichen, Crimes et Suicides à Maurer de Rire. It's a compilation of the most bizarre cases published in forensic literature. Worked at a mess for a bit, had a couple pass away from a two-person plane crash. When the autopsy began it smelled a bit like burnt BBQ, and the people in the body bags weren't in your typical dead lying flat position. They were kind of stuck in a fetal position-ish. Opened up the bag, and I saw weird bumps on each of their heads. Asked me what was up with the bumps. I guess at high temps the brain expands and needs somewhere to go. At some point it just kinda pops out of the skull. So their brains were some inside some outside of skull. Then we try examining the body, and it looks like a cheap prop from a movie. I notice a wedding band on the female passenger and try my best to remove it. The whole finger comes off with it, felt kinda bad. Then I spent 10 minutes trying to clean off what I can only imagine was human grease and burned flesh off the ring so we could package it up and eventually return it to the family. Plane crashes are pretty crazy. As a firefighter and SAR technician I can say I have seen all sorts of crazy things. And not a single one has bothered me at all. Except for the plane crash I worked a little over a year ago. All occupants save a little girl perished. If it wouldn't have been for the rainy conditions we might have had a terrible fire to deal with. That might have helped in all honesty. It is one thing to see an adult in a bad position dead, but a child is another. I can still to this day remember the image of loading the children into the trailer of our ATV to hand them over to the coroner. I would never wish a moment like that upon anyone. There are still nights that I wake up from having dreams of that night. Sometimes they feel so real I can smell the scent of JP8 lingering in the air of my room. In summary, plane crashes are terrible. But I know it is only a matter of time before one of the countless C-130s that fly through my county. Or even one of the Blackhawks goes down. I regularly post on unsolved mysteries, so I thought as was fitting here. One of the best cases on Forensic Files was Cold Case that had gone unsolved for decades. A man told police he had picked up a hitchhiker in the evening. After the man and the hitchhiker got into a fight, the man threw him out of his car 2 miles away from his mother's house on a busy highway. The man later came home to his mother's house, only to find the hitchhiker at his mother's house. He left to go call police from a payphone. This was before cell phones. The police found his mother dead in bed. The man was a beneficiary of a huge life insurance policy and was the prime suspect. The cops or anyone did not believe the man's story. It was inconceivable that the hitchhiker, who did not know where the mother's house was, could make a 2-mile journey with turns in a neighborhood to just randomly break in and kill the man's mother, who he didn't know. But there was blood at the scene and a palm print on the staircase that was not the man's nor the mother's. After some investigation, people at Hardee's did confirm that there was a man that fit the description looking to hitchhike. Still, they just assumed the man had paid the other man to kill his mother. 15 years later, after the invention of CODIS, the DNA was matched to a career criminal who definitely matched the description of the hitchhiker. After bringing him in and interrogating him, the killer had no idea he had killed the mother of the man who gave him a ride. He simply walked through this neighborhood looking for a house that looked empty, and his mother's was the only one without the lights on. It's baffling. Made an account and quit lurking just for this thread. Crime scene tech here. This one stands out as I was still training at the time. Suicide by gunshot. I went to an indoor range and rented a monster of a revolver, a Judge of Yerk. This thing could shoot 410-shot shells. The force basically blew the top of his head off. What remained of the skin from the top of his head was flapped into the skull cavity, and his eyes looked like they were bulging out. Blood and brains up to 10 feet away. Found his safety goggles about 10 yards down range. The scariest part was he was watching others shoot beforehand. Sometimes I wonder if he planned to take others with him. I was at a regional medical center in rural Guatemala when we had a case come in from an RTA, road traffic accident, involving a pedestrian and a chicken bus. For those of you who don't know, a popular, but incredibly dangerous, form of public transport are retired American school buses that have been painted all sorts of vibrant colors, but underneath the mechanics are shot to shit. Anyway, this pedestrian had been hit by one of these rolling death traps, which was fully loaded going around 80 miles per hour, and ended up getting wrapped under the front right wheel arch and completely mangled beyond recognition. They found bits of this guy spread 2 kilometers down the road, as the initial impact had split his torso down the middle and basically turned him inside out. When all the bits had been collected, the height of the body bag was around 2 inches, so you imagine the state of the remains. Passers-by helped us pick up bits from the side of the road, but dogs and cats ran off with a fair amount of the smaller bits. Guatemala is a cool place. Not a forensic scientist. But I majored in anthropology with a focus on forensic anthropology. Given that, I was a fairly regular reader of the Forensic Science Quarterly. Here are a couple that I remember. Kid found on top of an elevator in a 6-story dorm. Apparently he was elevator surfing, which is just as dumb as it sounds. He somehow got his head caught in the cables and got it twisted around a couple of times. This did not immediately kill him. He died from asphyxiation. This means he had anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple of minutes to contemplate what had happened to him before he lost consciousness. Another one was sort of a mystery case. Headless corpse found in a truck in a national park. No head was to be found in the immediate area. Truck was turned on but had run out of gas. The wound was very clean. No sawing, almost like a guillotine cut. The investigating authorities were rather confused, but eventually they found a receipt in his pocket for 50 yards of nylon rope. They widened the investigation and eventually found the rope tied to a tree with a noose at one end. Further searching of this area eventually turned up the head. Pretty unique method of suicide. Mystery solved. This one isn't from the magazine, but a story personally related to me from the officer involved. The call comes in for a 50-ish black woman dead in a garage. Investigation reveals it is actually a 35-year-old white male. Dude put on a dress, rigged a noose to his garage door opener, and proceeded to watch some porn in his garage while choking himself with the garage door opener. Battery in the remote died. And then so did he. Another case that sticks in my memory is of a guy that decided to kill himself with a .30-06 and a .308. For you non-gun people, those are 2 very powerful calibers. Literally overkill. Anyway, this guy manages to get 2 rifles under his chin and fire them at the same time while lying on his bed. This obliterates his head. I mean like there was nothing left but a stump. That isn't why the case sticks with me. However, what happened next is that the local forensic departments decides to reconstruct the head as an exercise. They collect every piece, except for the orbital sockets, which evaporated, and put them all back together. The result came out looking very much like the victim, although slightly bug-eyed. The before and after of that is something I don't think I'll ever forget.